Mount & Blade II Bannerlord is one of those games that seems like it should have been finished years ago, and yet somehow it still feels like it's stuck in some sort of development limbo. Don't get me wrong, we've had plenty of updates in the last few years, but it's been over a decade since the first whispers of a sequel to Warband started floating about. We've had the full early access cycle, a long-awaited 1.0 release, and dozens of patches and hotfixes. Yet still, if you ask anyone in the community today whether they feel like Bannerlord is finished, you'll probably be met with a long sigh or a potential no. So the question isn't just when will Bannerlord be finished, but rather, can it ever truly end? To understand why this question matters, you have to look at what the game is supposed to be. You see, Mount & Blade II Bannerlord wasn't just a sequel. This was going to be the next evolution of a genre-defining sandbox RPG, a deeper simulation, more complex politics, a living, breathing medieval world where you'd rise from a peasant to an emperor, and where every village and noble had a purpose. This was going to be Warband, but bigger and better in every conceivable way. And honestly, in some ways it is. In a lot of ways it is actually. The graphics are undeniably better. I mean, Warband wasn't exactly the strongest back in its day. Sieges are a lot more dramatic, especially after numerous patches and fixes. The scope of battles has increased. Of course, I think we forget the Mount & Blade Warband's battle size was 150 units on the battle at once. In Bannerlord, we have up to 1,000, and that's without modding. Speaking of modding support, there is plenty in the game at this point in time, and the community are keeping it running. Despite its quirks, this modding support and the modding tools is far more flexible than what we had with Warband, but the game still carries a strange sense of unfinishedness, not just in the technical sense with bugs and crashes, but in its design. Some of the systems feel a bit more shallow than they should. Features feel somewhat abandoned halfway through implementation, and crucially, there's no clear vision of what the final game is supposed to be. But what is the issue here? Well, of course, some of the issue does lie at Tailworld, the developers. They had a very different philosophy when it comes to game design, or at least from what their first title was. Bannerlord has always been about creating more of a platform, a sandbox for the community. I mean, this is shown in a perfect way by one of the updates from a couple of years ago where they released just a sandbox mode. Modders are the one who have brought this to life and utilized the incredible sandbox that Tailworlds have made, whether it's through massive overhauls like the Old Realms, Europe 1100, or Kingdoms of Ardub that, yes, we are still waiting for. Maybe even smaller ones, focused mods that patched holes or left the vanilla experience but tried to enhance it a little bit more. But the problem is, at least for Tailworlds, when your base game feels more like Scaffolding than a complete product, it creates a bit of an uneasy relationship between the developers and its community. Every time Tailworlds changes a system, releases a new patch, it risks breaking the long and hard hours that people have spent making modifications for their game. Every time a patch is released, modders scramble to update, and the more this happens, the more frustrated people get, and the more modders tend to leave the game alone. Because it feels like this game is in a state of perpetual construction without ever really reaching a polished or final point, at least not from something you'd expect that technically launched in 2022, and even then came out in early access in 2020, over 5 years ago. But let's talk about specifics. Let's take the kingdom management system. It does exist. You can go up the ranks and become a ruler. You can assign fiefs, make policies, call armies, even marry into others, but that's about where it ends. Diplomacy is a little bit bare bones still. AI lords have no real long-term strategy other than fighting. Peace and war is decided by RNG and influence points. No meaningful negotiations. There's no real storyline within the way that people go to war. You can't really follow characters. They just exist and do their own thing, seemingly at random. There is a marriage system, but it's not potentially, or at least in a great way, diplomatic. The vassal loyalty mechanics are very shallow. There's no risk and intrigue. It all feels very surface level, like a placeholder waiting for the real system to be implemented, but that real system has never arrived. It goes onto the economy. It was better than it is in early access, and of course much better than Warband, but it still feels incredibly fragile. There is a set amount of ways and some good paths and some not so good paths that you can take in order to grow your economy. Caravans and workshops can generate passive wealth, but do often in some ways feel a bit disconnected from the world simulation. Like I said, you set them up and then they just go. It all works in the background rather than having to actually manage them. Towns can starve, thieves can change hands constantly, and there's no real sense of supply lines, infrastructure, or economic growth. There's not really many situations where you'll find the same bandits going off your caravans, and then you find these characters and you make a nemesis that you have to hunt down so they stop actually going after you and stopping your supply lines. It is, once again, seemingly at random. Trading goods don't tell stories as I feel like they could do. There is so much potential here. You don't really feel the ripple effect of your economic decisions. Maybe you want to, I don't know, boost the economy of a certain area with gold or horses or velvet, and they become a rich powerhouse in the nation. That doesn't happen. And vice versa, completely blocking all the infrastructure and all the caravans in one area. Sure, it does technically have an effect on the way that the armies are built, but it's not particularly noticeable, at least not in a deeper level. It feels particularly like numbers on a spreadsheet, not necessarily the living economy that Bannerlord is aiming to go for. And then we have the character system. This one kind of hurts for a lot more of the long-term fans. In Warband, you had leveling up as well. It felt organic. You had these skills and attributes and proficiencies. You improved through doing things like, fighting and hand-to-hand or shooting with your bow. Your character was becoming something. In Bannerlord, you have more of a perk system, a huge sprawling web of choices, many of which don't necessarily have huge impacts, and it's painfully slow to get meaningful progression out of it. If you want to be a smithing expert, prepare to spend dozens of hours doing the same repetitive tasks in order to unlock even basic recipes. Want to improve leadership or even get bigger armies? You better be commanding these armies 24/7, and it does feel more like a grind. And even when you get to that level, you don't feel like you are the powerhouse that you should have earned, other than the amount of troop you have at your disposal. None of this is to say that Bannerlord is a bad game. In fact, it is one of my favorite games of all time. But I think, on the contrary, for many people, it's one of those engrossing experiences in modern gaming that fans still feel like something might be missing. There's nothing quite like leading a 500-man army into battle or pulling off a last-minute win against overwhelming odds. The combat system is incredible still. It kind of delivers that visceral medieval warfare, yet still feels good to play, and they've focused on the gameplay side of it rather than just the brutality. But the problem is, Bannerlord still just feels like an engine with so much potential. It is this scaffolding, this sandbox, but as the years go by, the window for that actual direction from Tailward seems to be shrinking. Granted, they are not the big AAA company like EA or Blizzard, but they have grown. How much longer can they justify bringing out these smaller patches? Well, that also did start to change. More recently, we've had the announcement of War Sails, the first expansion for Mount & Blade II Bannerlord, and this is what a lot of the silence was about. Developer blogs are starting to release now about adding in full naval combat, being able to board from ship to ship, a new Nordic faction as well that's going to bring in a whole new dynamic to the campaign. Think of it a little bit like an invading force that the rest of the factions of Calradia now have to defend themselves against, learning new combat and new ways to fight. Even the Kuzate Horse Lords are going to have to learn how to get onto boats and fight in open ocean, and I think this is an incredible addition. Maybe this is a sign that things are going to start changing from Mount & Blade, and things are starting to head in a more specific direction. It has been 5 years, but it is something, even if it is a lot later than many might have wanted. There's also a broader industry trend that is worth talking about. More and more games are being released as platforms rather than products. Think of Star Citizen, Ark, even Skyrim at this point. Games are never really finished in the traditional sense, but constantly updated, iterated, and expanded, either officially or through community effort. In that model, Bannerlord actually fits kind of right in. It's the right kind of game that maybe never will have a definitive version. It will get patches, updates, maybe even expansions and mods forever, or at least until Tailwords make a sequel. And maybe that's fine. Maybe Bannerlord isn't meant to be finished in the way we usually expect. Maybe it's my expectations of Mount & Blade Warband that had a release and then just had numbers of DLCs afterwards. This could be just another game that you revisit every few years to see what's changing, as that's the way the gaming industry seems to be heading. Is it about feature completedness? About polish? About telling a coherent story? Bannerlord doesn't necessarily have a really in-depth story. They were talking about adding a storyline expansion, but that's kind of been cast to the side. I mean, the whole Dragon Banner narrative does feel a little bit bolted on, and I think now that they've cancelled whatever plans they had for a storyline DLC, now I don't think we're ever going to get one. The tragedy is that Bannerlord gets so close to being the perfect RPG. The bones are all there, the battles are thrilling, the world is vast, the potential is obvious, but the connective tissue, the diplomacy, the meaningful character growth and connections that you can have, the artificial intelligence, always feels like you're just playing a really good alpha. not necessarily a finished game. Then we have the future to talk about. Of course, there is always going to be additions, there's always going to be polish, and there's always going to be more expansions. I love the fact that Tales are now focusing on more content coming into the game, and maybe, just maybe, this does mean that we will get a finished conclusion, but I don't see any signs of it actually getting to an endpoint, at least within the next few years. It's a strange conclusion, because maybe Bannerlord is less of a game and more of a canvas, a medieval sandbox engine, designed to be shaped and reshaped endlessly by players, coders, and storytellers. So if you go in expecting a tight, polished experience with a clear beginning, middle, and end, you're probably going to be disappointed. Yet if you treat it as a foundation for your own stories, your own rules, and your own vision of medieval warfare, then it starts to make a little bit more sense. So can it ever be finished? Technically, yes. Tales could one day drop a 2.0 patch, tie a bow on it, and then say, we finished. But spiritually, philosophically, I'm not sure that will ever be. And that's not really the way games work these days. They never say we're done with the game, they just announce a new title, and people assume that it's all finished. But let me know what you think. Do you think Bannerlord can ever get to an endpoint, or do we think it's going to go on forever until Mount and Blade 3 is finally announced, potentially within the next few years? Leave a comment down below, but until then, I will see you in the next one.